In the autumn of 1932, on a forgotten patch of Minnesota timberland, people saw something that made no sense. They saw a young man, barely 19, digging a hole. Not for a root cellar and not for a well. He was digging the foundation for his cabin down, sinking it 4 feet into the iron-rich soil. Then, stranger still, he began building a second structure next to it. A woodshed, but built with the care of a church. It was insulated. It had a raised, vented floor. It had a chimney. Travelers on the county road would slow their horses. They'd stare at the boy, Elias Thorne, and his young wife, Mary, working from dawn to dusk. They'd see him building a palace for his firewood and a half-buried box for his family. The whispers started at the general store in Grand Marais. They said the boy's stepfather, a hard-headed logger named Magnus, had finally kicked him out for being too clever and not clever enough. They said the boy had lost his mind. But when the winter of 1933 hit, a winter of such relentless, bone-breaking cold that it earned its own chapter in the state almanac, that crazy, half-buried cabin and its glorified woodshed would prove the difference between survival and surrender. The numbers that came out of that cabin would silence an entire valley of doubters. If you want to hear the one number, the specific temperature reading that made the most respected builder in the county admit he'd been wrong for 30 years, stay until the end. What did this outcast kid, with nothing but an axe and a stubborn will, understand about heat, wood, and shelter that every seasoned woodsman in northern Minnesota had missed? If you enjoy these stories of quiet competence, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Elias Thorne wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 19-year-old boy trying to keep his pregnant wife from freezing to death. Kicked off his stepfather's logging claim with little more than $100, a good axe, and the clothes on his back, he had no choice but to make a go of it on a worthless plot of cut-over land his own father had left him. By the standards of the day, the small shack they inherited was respectable enough. It was 16 by 20, built of green pine logs, chinked with mud and moss. It had a cast-iron stove that could burn 4-foot logs. It looked just like every other cabin in the county. And that was the problem. Their first winter, the winter of '31, was a brutal education. It wasn't a record breaker, just a normal, grinding Minnesota winter. Elias worked from dawn until dusk, felling and bucking timber. He stacked 4 cords of wood by October, then 6, then 8. It was never enough. The green wood, heavy with moisture and sap, would hiss and bubble on the fire. It produced more smoke than heat. A constant choking haze filled the small cabin. Soot rained down on their blankets. The cold was a physical presence. It crept through the walls, radiating inward. Mary stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Condensation from their breath would freeze in crystalline patterns on the interior walls. They ate with their coats on. They slept under a mountain of blankets and still woke up shivering. Elias fed the hungry stove every 2 hours, all through the night. He was exhausted, constantly chopping, constantly hauling for a cabin that barely stayed above 45 degrees. His wife, Mary, her face pale and drawn, never complained. But Elias saw the fear in her eyes. He saw her hands, red and chapped from washing clothes in water that was barely lukewarm. He felt the oppressive damp chill that never, ever left. He'd lie awake at night, listening to the wind scour the cabin, and a thought he couldn't shake would return to him. A memory from the 2 years he'd spent working on the Great Lakes ore freighters before his father died and he had to come home. He remembered the engine rooms. He remembered the fight against condensation on the cold steel hulls. He remembered the chief engineer, a grizzled old Swede, explaining the physics of it. "It ain't the cold that gets you, kid," the old man had said, tapping a pipe against a sweating bulkhead. "It's the water. Water steals heat 100 times faster than dry air. Get rid of the water. You solve the problem." Elias looked at his woodpile, covered in snow, the logs slick with ice. He thought about the sizzle and steam when he threw a log into the stove. He was spending half his BTUs, half his energy, just boiling water. He wasn't burning wood to heat his cabin. He was burning wood to dry other wood. The wind didn't just chill the air. It was a thief. It stripped heat directly from the log walls, a process called convective heat loss. His cabin was a leaky bucket in a rainstorm of cold. That spring, as the thaw came, a plan began to form. It was a two-part solution. First, he had to stop the wind. Second, he had to burn perfectly, absolutely bone-dry wood. His plan was simple in principle, but it looked like madness to everyone else. He would build a new home, one that hid from the wind, and he would build a machine for making perfect firewood. He started digging in May. Mary, her belly just beginning to swell, helped him clear the stones. He dug down 4 feet, hitting the frost line, creating a 20 by 20-foot pit. He wasn't building a cellar. He was using the earth itself as his first wall. The ground below the frost line maintains a relatively constant temperature, around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't matter if the air outside is 70 above or 40 below. The earth itself would be his insulation against the wind. He laid a thick bed of coarse gravel for drainage, then began building his foundation and floor joists up from there. The cabin walls only rose 4 feet above the ground, with a steeply pitched roof to shed the massive snows. From the road, it looked like a structure sinking into the ground. But the real work, the part that earned him the ridicule, was the woodshed. He bought a load of reject lumber from the sawmill, warped boards, knot-filled planks, for pennies on the dollar. He paid $30 for it all. He framed a long, narrow building, 12 feet wide and 24 feet long. But he didn't build it on the ground. He built it on posts, 2 feet up. The floor was not solid. It was made of slats, with a 1-inch gap between each board. He sheathed the walls tightly, but installed baffled vents high on one wall and low on the opposite, creating a natural chimney effect. He built a small, simple brick firebox at one end, with a long run of stovepipe snaking through the length of the shed before exiting through a tall chimney. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. He wasn't going to burn big fires in it. He would only use it to burn the bark, the scrap, the punky wood, the garbage nobody else used, to maintain a tiny, constant pilot fire. The goal wasn't to heat the shed to a high temperature. The goal was to keep the air inside just 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the air outside. Warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. As the slightly warmed air rose through the slatted floor and circulated around the stacked wood, it would act like a sponge, pulling the moisture out of the logs. The steady, gentle draft created by the vents would then carry that moisture-laden air up and out of the shed. It was a passive solar kiln, a slow-motion convection oven for wood. He was creating an environment that was actively hostile to moisture. He spent the summer cutting wood, not for the coming winter, but for the winter after. He stacked it meticulously in the new shed, leaving air gaps for circulation. By August, the main cabin was taking shape. He used shiplap siding over tar paper, creating a tight envelope. The windows were small and few, mostly facing south to catch the low winter sun. The inside was simple, one room with a sleeping loft above. The strangeness of the project was undeniable. The house looked half buried. The woodshed, built with more care and complexity than the house itself, stood beside it like a monument to some strange obsession. Total cost for the new homestead, under $100. The $30 for lumber, $10 for hardware and tar paper, $40 for a new, smaller, more efficient stove, and the rest for glass and nails. Mary stood beside him as he fitted the final door. She wrung her hands, a gesture he'd come to know meant she was worried. "Elias," she said softly, her voice barely carrying on the breeze, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Elias didn't turn from his work. He planed the edge of the door, watching the shavings curl at his feet. "Let them," he said. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw fear. They saw eccentricity. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with a visit from Silas Croft. Croft owned the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in the county. He was a big man, respected, whose opinion carried weight. He pulled his truck up one afternoon in late September, ostensibly to see if Elias needed any more lumber. He walked around the strange, low-slung cabin, kicking at the mounded earth banked against the walls. He peered into the cathedral-like woodshed. "Thorne," he said, not unkindly, "what in God's name are you doing?" Elias was splitting kindling, his movements steady and economical. "Building a place." "You've buried it," Croft stated, as if Elias might not have noticed. "That's a recipe for rot. The frost will heave those walls, and you'll have water in here every spring. And this?" He gestured to the woodshed. "This is a waste of good material on a shed. You've built your woodshed better than your house." It was a technical objection, delivered from a place of experience. It sounded reasonable. Elias just kept working. "Just trying something different, Silas." Croft shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Different isn't always better. There's a reason we've built cabins the same way for 70 years. It works." He got back in his truck and drove away. The verdict was in. The public mockery was crueler. It happened at the general store. Elias was there to buy flour and salt. Jed Carter, a burly teamster known for his loud mouth and quick temper, saw him come in. "Well, look what the gopher dragged in," Jed boomed, loud enough for the half-dozen men around the stove to hear. "Hey, Thorne, you planning on hibernating this winter? Hear you built yourself a fancy root cellar with a chimney?" The men laughed. It was a sharp, biting sound. A cruel nickname was born. From that day on, people referred to Elias's home as the Gopher Hole or Thorne's Folly. Elias bought his goods, nodded to the storekeeper, and left without a word. His face was a calm, unreadable mask. He never explained. He never argued. He just kept working. The gossip network buzzed. Men at the logging camps talked about the crazy kid who was scared of the wind. Women at the church quilting circle whispered about that poor Mary. married to a boy who was clearly unwell, building them a tomb to live in. People would make excuses to ride down the county road, slowing their wagons to stare at the strange homestead. It became a local curiosity, a cautionary tale in the making. Mary felt the pressure most acutely. The other women were polite to her face, but their kindness was laced with pity. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. One day, at a church social, a woman named Agnes Miller took her aside. "Dear," she said, patting Mary's arm, "is everything all right with Elias? If you need a safe place to stay when the bad weather comes, our door is always open." The implication was clear. Your husband's creation will fail, and you will need charity. Mary just smiled tightly. "Elias knows what he's doing," she said, a quiet defense that convinced no one. The institutional skeptic arrived in the form of Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent. He was a man who believed in manuals and government bulletins. He'd heard the talk and came to see for himself. He was polite, professional, but deeply concerned. He took notes on a clipboard. "Mr. Thorne," he said, peering at the ventilation system in the woodshed, "I have to be honest. This design, it's not in any manual I've ever seen. My concern is moisture management in the primary dwelling. A subterranean structure without modern vapor barriers, you could have serious problems with mold and air quality." "I've accounted for it," Elias said simply. "I hope you have," Abernathy replied, his tone full of doubt. He made a note on his clipboard. "I'll be back to check on you after the first big freeze." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Elias's older brother Thomas came to visit. Thomas had stayed on with their stepfather, Magnus. He was a company man, a man who followed the rules. He looked at the cabin, his face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Elias, what is this?" he asked, his voice low. "Magnus is furious. He says you're making a fool of the family name. People are laughing at us." "I'm building a home, Thomas." "You're building a joke," his brother shot back, his frustration boiling over. "People are going to think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. They think you don't know how to build a proper cabin, so you buried your mistake." Elias finally stopped his work and looked his brother in the eye. His voice was level, without a trace of anger. "I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm trying to keep my family warm." Thomas just threw his hands up in disgust and left. By November, with the first flurries dusting the ground, not one person in the county thought Elias Thorne had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own fear and incompetence. They waited for the winter to teach him the lesson he refused to learn from his elders. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Elias right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1933 is still recorded in Minnesota's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It wasn't just one blizzard, it was a siege, a relentless grinding assault of Arctic air that descended from Canada and refused to leave. It started on December 8th. The thermometer plunged to -18 overnight, normal for a cold snap, but it didn't snap. December 12th, the mercury hit -31. By December 18th, it was locked at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. The wind chills were a theoretical deadly number somewhere below -70. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in Grand Marais never once climbed above zero. The snow came with the cold, fine and dry as sand, driven by the merciless wind. It buried fences, blocked roads, and piled in drifts that reached the rooftops of conventional cabins. The valley began to break. The community suffering was not abstract. It was a collection of specific, desperate failures. The Croft family, Silas Croft of the sawmill, was burning through 2 full cords of their best seasoned hardwood per month, and their large, handsome house was holding a shivering 42 degrees. Their children were sick with hacking coughs. Silas was delivering emergency firewood around the clock, his truck barely able to navigate the drifted roads. The Colby Ranch, with its 20 head of cattle, lost 6 of them in the first week, frozen solid in their barn. They were burning half a cord of wood a week just to keep the main house above freezing. Their wood was green, cut that summer, and it smoldered and smoked, coating their chimney with thick creosote. On December 20th, their chimney caught fire. They were lucky to put it out before it took the whole house. Jed Carter, the man who had mocked Elias, had it worse. His cabin was poorly chinked. The wind drove snow directly through the gaps in his walls. He and his family huddled in a single room, stuffing clothes and blankets against the logs. They ran out of dry wood and started burning fence posts. Then furniture. Everywhere the story was the same. The immense amount of fuel being consumed just to stay alive was staggering. Families were burning wood they had planned to last until March. The sound of axes echoed constantly in the frozen air as men desperately cut more, their breath freezing on their beards. The wood was so cold and green it was nearly impossible to split. Children stayed home from the one-room schoolhouse, too cold to make the journey. The circuit doctor was trapped in town. It was a silent, creeping disaster. And then people started noticing the Thorne place. The first to notice was Silas Croft on one of his desperate delivery runs. As he chugged past the turnoff to Elias's property, he saw a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. Not the thick, choking plume of wet wood smoke he saw everywhere else. It was a pale, clean haze, a sign of a hot, efficient fire. A few days later, he saw Elias outside. The temperature was -30. Elias was in his shirt sleeves, splitting kindling. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't shivering. He moved with a calm, deliberate energy. Silas slowed his truck, staring. It didn't make sense. The mail carrier, who made his rounds by sleigh, told a similar story at the general store. He said the snow on the roof of Thorne's cabin was deep and undisturbed. On every other roof in the county, the heat leaking from the house melted the first layers of snow, creating a crust of ice. The deep snow on Elias's roof meant only one thing. No heat was escaping. All of it was staying inside. The whispers began to change. The mockery died down, replaced by a confused, grudging curiosity. Something impossible was happening in the gopher hole. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley, it rewrote the rules. The vindication began on December 23rd, the coldest day of the siege. The official temperature at dawn was -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas Croft was at the end of his rope. His own family was cold, his customers were desperate, and his supply of seasoned hardwood was gone. All he had left was green birch. He remembered the calm way Elias had been splitting wood. He remembered the clean smoke. Swallowing his pride, he loaded a quarter cord of his best wood onto his truck, a gift or a peace offering, and drove to Thorne's Folly. He figured at the very least the boy and his pregnant wife would need the help. He pulled up to the half-buried cabin. The silence was profound. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, his knuckles stinging from the cold. The door swung open, and the first thing that hit him wasn't a sight or a sound. It was a feeling, the warmth. It hit him like stepping into a different season. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an over-stoked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, comfortable warmth. It wrapped around him, a physical shock that made his frozen face ache. Mary Thorne stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a coat or even a heavy sweater. She was in a simple cotton dress. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Croft saw Elias at the table, reading a book. He was in a simple work shirt. There was a cradle near the stove, and in it their newborn daughter, just a week old, slept peacefully under a light blanket. The visual was so powerful, so contrary to everything happening in the rest of the valley, that Silas was speechless for a moment. He saw dignity. He saw comfort. "Silas," Mary said, her voice calm, "it's good to see you. Come in out of the cold." "Mary, I brought some wood," he stammered, gesturing to his truck. "I figured you might be running low." "That's kind of you," she said with a genuine smile. "But we're managing fine. Elias, Silas Croft is here." Elias came to the door. "Silas, everything all right?" "No, son, it's not all right," Croft said, his voice raw. "People are freezing. Chimneys are catching fire. We're burning wood as fast as we can cut it. How are you doing this?" "We're all right," Elias said. "We're burning less than a quarter cord a month." The number was so absurd it barely registered. "A quarter cord? A month?" Silas said, his voice full of disbelief. "People are burning half a cord a week. I'm burning 2 cords a month, and my house is 45 degrees if I'm lucky." His eyes scanned the small room, looking for the trick. He saw the small, efficient stove, glowing with a soft red heat. There was no smoke. There was no hiss of steam. Then he saw the thermometer on the far wall, an old, reliable mercury thermometer. He walked over to it, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He squinted. He wiped his eyes. He looked again. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees, while outside it was 42 degrees below zero, a difference of 110 degrees. It was an impossible number. Silas Croft, the man who built cabins for a living, couldn't reconcile it. He walked back to the door and looked outside at the brutal, frozen landscape, then back into the warm, quiet cabin. He touched the interior walls. They weren't cold. They weren't weeping with condensation. They were cool, but they were bone dry. He pulled out his own pocket thermometer. He held it up. After a few minutes, it settled. 67 degrees. He turned back to Elias. The boy wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching, waiting. "Your wood," Silas said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "It's the wood." "It helps," Elias said. "Let me see it." Elias led him out the back, through a short, covered walkway that connected the house to the miraculous woodshed. When Elias opened the door, Silas understood. The air inside was cool, but it was actively, aggressively dry. A tiny fire glowed in the brick firebox at the far end. The stacked wood, pine, birch, poplar, wasn't just seasoned. It looked ancient. It was light as cork. The ends were cracked and checked, a sign of extremely low moisture content. Elias picked up a split log. It felt weightless in Silas's hand. "This wood has maybe 8% moisture content," Elias explained. "The wood you're burning cut this year is over 50%. For every 10 pounds of your wood you put in the stove, 5 pounds is water. It takes over 1,000 BTUs of energy to turn 1 pound of water into steam. You're losing thousands of BTUs before the wood even starts making useful heat." The data, the simple physics of it, was irrefutable. Elias wasn't just burning wood more efficiently. He was burning a different kind of fuel altogether. Silas looked at the comparison. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords a month, 42 degrees. Jed Carter's cabin, burning furniture to stay above freezing. His own house, 2 cords a month, 45 degrees. Elias Thorne's cabin, a quarter cord a month, 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Silas Croft stood there in the dry, still air of the woodshed, the brutal wind howling outside. He looked at the massive stacks of perfectly prepared fuel. He looked back at the small, warm house where a newborn baby was sleeping safely. He turned to the 19-year-old boy his entire community had mocked. He cleared his throat. "Elias," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't hide, "we've been doing this wrong for 70 years." It was a complete surrender, an admission of a fundamental generational error. The vindication wasn't just about being right. It was about what being right meant. It meant Mary didn't have to worry about her baby. It meant Elias wasn't a failure, but a provider. It meant winter could be a season to be lived through, not just survived. Later that week, Mr. Abernathy, the county agent, made it out on a snowmobile, fulfilling his promise to check on them. He brought calibrated instruments. He measured the interior temperature, the exterior temperature, the humidity. He documented Elias's fuel consumption. Elias, it turned out, had been keeping meticulous records in a ledger. Daily high and low temperatures, inside and out. How much wood he used each day. This wasn't luck. It was engineering. Abernathy stopped taking notes. He just started watching and listening. By the time the Great Freeze broke in mid-January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at Thorne's Folly. The story of Silas Croft's visit had spread like wildfire. The mockery was replaced by a quiet, desperate awe. The spread of an idea isn't a single event. It's a series of small, practical choices made by people in need. The first convert was a neighbor named Ben Carter, Jed Carter's cousin. Ben was a practical farmer, not a logger, and the winter had nearly wiped him out. His wife had been sick for weeks. He came to Elias in February, hat in hand. He didn't have the time or money to build a subterranean cabin, but he was fascinated by the woodshed. "Elias," he said, "I can't dig a hole like you did. But that shed? Can you show me how you built that shed?" Elias didn't lecture. He didn't say, "I told you so." He walked Ben over to the woodshed and spent 2 hours explaining the principles. The raised floor, the baffled vents, the small pilot stove, the importance of stacking for airflow. Ben wasn't a great carpenter, but he was a good scrounger. He built a smaller, uglier version out of scrap and salvaged tin. He spent that summer cutting and drying his wood according to Elias's method. The next winter, which was a normal, cold Minnesota winter, Ben Carter's family was warm for the first time. He used half the wood he normally would have, and his house stayed 20 degrees warmer. That was all the proof the valley needed. Replicability. The adoption accelerated. 7 families built thorn sheds that spring. 12 more followed that summer. Silas Croft, in a move that stunned the county, redesigned the standard cabin he sold as a kit. The new Croft Northwind model included plans for a smaller, tighter house and a separate, ventilated woodshed. He gave Elias full credit, a public act of humility that cemented the boy's reputation. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, became Elias's greatest champion. He wrote a detailed bulletin for the University of Minnesota Extension Service, titled Efficient Fuel Wood Management for Cold Climates, a case study from Cook County. It was filled with his data, diagrams of Elias's designs, and testimonials from farmers who had adopted the method. The bulletin was distributed across the northern states. Within 5 years, variations of the thorn shed could be found from Wisconsin to Montana. What Elias Thorne had built in 1932, using intuition from a completely different field, anticipated by nearly 50 years what building scientists would later call a super-insulated envelope and the principles of passive solar design. He had treated his home as a system where the fuel, the storage, the stove, and the shelter were all interconnected parts of a single machine designed for warmth. Years later, when a young journalist came to interview him about the legendary winter of '33, Elias was a middle-aged man with a successful timber business of his own. The journalist asked him if he felt proud of inventing a new way to live in the North. Elias just shook his head. "This isn't new," he said, his voice the same calm, level tone it had always been. "The principles are as old as fire. It's just correct." The original cabin still stands, a testament to a young man's quiet refusal to accept a miserable reality. The earth is still banked against its walls. The woodshed, its lumber now silver with age, is still full of perfectly dry wood. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness, and it didn't reward tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet observer who saw the real problem, not the cold, but the water, and solved it, not with money or new technology, but with a better understanding of the world as it is. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below and tell us your story. And for more proven frontier techniques every week, make sure you're subscribed. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters, names, and specific events are fictional, but the techniques described are based on real historical practices and the timeless principles of building science and thermodynamics.